The screaming did not come from the mouth. It came from the bones themselves, from joints that bent the wrong way, from skulls that never learned the correct shape to hold a human face. In the back room of a mountain house, where the floorboards sagged like ribs under rotting skin, 2 infants lay wrapped in stained quilts, their cries rising and falling together, not in harmony but in echo, as if one pain could not exist without the other. Their heads were swollen, stretched tight with pressure, skin thin as wax over something struggling to escape, fingers fused, limbs shortened, eyes too far apart staring without focus, already heavy with a knowledge they were never meant to carry. Outside, the forest listened. The wind moved through bare branches like breath through a throat that had forgotten how to speak. Snow pressed against the windows, sealing the house from the rest of the world. No road noise, no neighbors. Only the slow, wet sounds of life going wrong in a place where no one would come to witness it. This was not the first time such sounds had been heard in these hills. They had names for it once. Bad blood, folded roots, a family tree that had grown inward instead of outward, curling back on itself until the branches strangled the trunk. But those words were never written down. They were passed in whispers, traded for silence, buried with the dead. The children lived, against expectation, against prayer, against the quiet hope that nature might correct what humans refused to confront. They lived. Their breathing was labored, their movements small and incomplete, but their presence was undeniable. 2 bodies bound by more than birth, sharing a suffering that had been rehearsed long before either of them existed. The house absorbed their cries into its walls. The mountain took note. It is said that when something unnatural survives, it demands a cost later. The people who lived nearest to that ridge would later speak of sleepless nights, of hearing weeping carried downhill by the cold air. Some claimed the sound came from a woman. Others swore it was children calling for each other, voices tangled together, impossible to separate. No one went to look. Everyone already knew where the sound came from, and knowing was enough to keep their doors shut. Before this story sinks deeper, before the records close again and the names blur into rumor, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because the place this happened no longer appears on most maps. And the time it began matters more than anyone realized. It began in a stretch of the Appalachian Mountains where isolation was not an accident, but an inheritance. A place settled by people who believed the world beyond the trees was corrupt, and that survival meant turning inward, again and again, until there was nowhere left to turn. The twins were not the beginning. They were the proof. The land that held them was already old when the first cabin was cut into its slope. Long before county lines or road numbers, the ridges here were known only by how difficult they were to leave. Steep grades, blind hollows, streams that flooded without warning and vanished just as quickly. Even in the early 20th century, when rail lines stitched together much of the country, this pocket of the mountains remained untouched, a dark pocket between more cooperative valleys. The town nearest to the ridge did not have a proper name at first. It was marked on surveyor maps as a blank space, later annotated in pencil by clerks who never visited. A church appeared before a school, graves before census records. The people who lived there were counted only when they died, and even then, only if someone bothered to report it. Families settled in clusters, bound not just by blood, but by necessity. A bad winter could trap them for months. Illness moved quietly, taking the young and the weak without ceremony. Outsiders were rare, and when they came, they did not stay. There was nothing here to draw them in, and too many unspoken reasons to push them away. One family claimed the highest ground along the ridge, where the soil was thin and the wind never fully rested. Their name appeared in land deeds going back to the late 18th century, spelled differently each time, as if even the clerks were unsure how to record. Something that refused to fit. They built their main house facing away from the valley, windows turned toward the trees instead of the road. Over the years, smaller structures appeared nearby, cabins placed close enough to be reached on foot but far enough to maintain the illusion of separation. They married early, they married quietly, and more often than not, they married each other. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. Cousins marrying cousins was not unusual in isolated places. The mountains made choices for people long before they believed they were choosing for themselves. But as decades passed, the same surnames repeated. The same faces reappeared, slightly altered, like copies made from copies until the details softened and then distorted. Old church records noted children born small, children who did not speak when they should have, children whose eyes never aligned properly with the world in front of them. These entries were never highlighted. They were written in the same careful hand as marriages and deaths, tucked between hymns and weather notes. By the time the country entered the Great Depression, the Ridge existed in a different century. Radios were rare. Newspapers arrived weeks late, if at all. The outside world's crises barely penetrated the tree line. What mattered here was lineage, and the quiet insistence that survival depended on keeping it intact. When the twins were born, the family had already folded inward for generations. Their parents shared not only a last name, but grandparents, great-grandparents, ancestors who stared back at them from fading photographs, faces familiar enough to feel comforting, similar enough to feel inevitable. The mountains had watched this pattern repeat itself for over 100 years. This time they did not look away. The pregnancy was spoken about in lowered voices, even within the house. There had been children before, and there would likely be children again, but this one carried a weight that made the air feel thicker. The mother grew smaller as her body worked against itself. Her appetite faded. Her sleep fractured into short, restless stretches broken by sharp dreams she refused to describe. Those who saw her in the weeks before the birth said she walked carefully, as if afraid of disturbing something already wrong. When the labor began, winter was closing its grip around the ridge. Snow came early that year, heavy and persistent, sealing the dirt road in both directions. The nearest doctor was miles away and unreachable. As had been done for generations, the women of the family gathered instead, hands practiced in delivering life under conditions that allowed for no mistakes. The first child emerged in silence, no immediate cry, no sudden rush of sound to reassure those waiting, only the wet, labored movement of breath forcing its way into a body not built to welcome it. The second followed soon after, its arrival marked by the same wrong quiet, the same hesitate, ion between existence and refusal. They were laid side by side on the kitchen table beneath a single hanging bulb. What the women saw made several of them turn away. Heads swollen and misshapen, skin stretched tight and pale, limbs that seemed unfinished, fingers that never fully separated, pressed together like they had grown tired of becoming anything else. One of the older women crossed herself repeatedly, whispering words she had learned as a child, words meant to ward off evil, or perhaps to explain it. Someone said the blood had gone bad. The babies were wrapped and moved to the back room, where the walls were thickest and the windows smallest. Their breathing was uneven, accompanied by soft, choking sounds that never fully resolved into cries. The mother watched without speaking, her face emptied of expression, as if something essential had already been taken from her. Days passed, then weeks. They did not die. Their survival unsettled everyone. Each morning brought a quiet disappointment that quickly transformed into dread. The children fed poorly, their mouths struggling to perform even the most basic tasks. Their heads continued to grow, slowly, relentlessly, as if something inside was expanding without permission. Their bodies lagged behind, thin and fragile, skin bruising easily beneath careful hands. As months turned into years, it became clear they would never develop like the others. They did not sit, they did not crawl, their eyes wandered independently, fixing on things no one else could see. Sounds escaped them in short, breathless bursts that seemed more reflex than communication, yet they reacted to each other. When separated, even briefly, their distress was immediate and violent. Their bodies tensed, their breathing accelerated, and a thin, keening sound filled the room until they were placed together again. When side by side, their agitation eased, replaced by a stillness that unnerved those watching. They lay with their heads turned inward, foreheads nearly touching, as if listening to something shared between them. The family stopped bringing visitors. Whispers traveled anyway, down the mountain, into the town, into places where people pretended not to listen while remembering every word. Stories of twins who never aged properly, of children trapped in bodies that refused to cooperate, of a house where suffering had learned to breathe. The mountains, patient as ever, waited for what would come next. As the twins grew heavier, the house grew quieter. Not with peace, but with exhaustion. Every movement required planning. Every night demanded vigilance. Sleep became something taken in fragments, never fully claimed. The mother carried the weight of it most, her arms thickened by constant strain, her back permanently curved, as if she were still bent over the table where the children had first been laid. The father withdrew into the land. He worked the fields longer than necessary, hunted farther into the woods. Han was wise and returned home smelling of damp leaves and iron. When he looked at the children, his gaze passed through them, as though acknowledging their existence required more than he could give. Silence settled between the parents like rot in a beam, invisible until it weakened everything around it. At night the sounds began, not screams at first, low vocalizations that rose and fell in unison, drifting through the thin walls and out into the trees. Neighbors miles away later claimed the noises followed patterns, repeating at the same hours each night, as if marking time. Dogs refused to go near the ridge. Livestock grew skittish, breaking enclosures for no clear reason. Inside the house, the twins developed habits no one taught them. They would press their heads together and rock, slowly, rhythmically, for long stretches. Their hands moved in small, repetitive motions, fingers rubbing against fused digits as if searching for a shape they remembered but could not find. When light from the window crossed their faces just right, it became apparent that their skulls were not merely misshapen but asymmetrical, each child reflecting a distorted half of the other. Drawings appeared on scraps of paper left too close to them, crude lines made by hands guided by someone else or something else, circles within circles, figures with too many limbs, a tree whose branches turned inward and met at the trunk, forming a closed loop. No one admitted to giving them pencils. The mother began speaking to them differently, not in the softened voice reserved for children, but in a hushed, confessional tone. She told them stories no one remembered telling her, stories of ancestors who married in secret, of babies buried without names, of warnings ignored because there had been no one left to warn them. Sometimes she spoke as if the twins already understood, other times as if they were the ones reminding her. The town took notice when animals started turning up dead near the property line. Chickens with twisted necks, a goat found with its legs arranged unnaturally, joints bent past what bone should allow. There were no signs of predators, only the sense that something had been handled by hands unfamiliar with restraint. The church sent a man to speak with the family. He did not go inside. He stood at the edge of the yard and called out, offering prayers, offering help, offering absolution. The father listened from the porch without responding. The mother watched from an upstairs window, the twin silhouettes visible behind her, their heads unnaturally large against the glass. That winter, the snow came earlier and stayed longer than anyone remembered. The road disappeared completely. The ridge was cut off in a way that felt final. Inside the house, the twins began to do something new. They laughed, not the spontaneous sound of joy, but a low, synchronized exhalation that rose and fell between them, perfectly timed, perfectly matched. It was the sound of recognition, of something aligning at last. The mountains, having waited long enough, drew closer. It was in the spring of that year, when the snow finally receded into the hollows, that the truth revealed itself in full. The whispers that had traveled from ridge to town, faint and trembling, now had names, dates, and faces to attach themselves to. The mother, the father, and the twins were not merely a family of misfortune. They were the continuation of a line that had folded back upon itself again and again. Cousins married cousins, generations repeated the same union, until the blood carried a memory of itself, a stubborn echo of each past failure and each past deformity. It was easy for outsiders to call it sin, for the mountains to call it inevitable, but inside the house it was neither. It was practice, repetition, a law written in the genome and whispered into each new life as if the house itself were an instructor. Every child, every marriage, every death bore the mark of what had come before. By the time the twins were old enough to notice the patterns around them, they had no one outside the family who could teach them anything different. The town reacted slowly at first. Curiosity brought some, suspicion brought more. But the real horror came not from the deformities alone, nor the strange sounds from the back room. It was in the realization that the family had, for decades, been turning inward, collapsing upon itself, and the effects were tangible. Hand. S fused together, skulls bulging, bodies that refused to follow the instructions given to them by nature, a collective weight of inevitability, an imprint of ancestral error, pressed on everyone who dared look closely. When the local constable finally pressed for an explanation, the father refused to answer. The mother spoke in hushed tones only to her children, repeating phrases that sounded like incantations. "The blood. It must remain," she whispered. "Only the blood knows its path." She avoided the word wrong, the word cursed. It was neither. It was lineage obeying itself. And then came the night that would be remembered, though never officially recorded. A winter storm, sudden and merciless, buried the ridge in snow. Visibility dropped to nothing. Inside, arguments had begun, small at first, then escalating into screams. "It's unnatural. Look at them. Look at what we've done," the mother cried, her voice cracking like thin ice. The father, pale with exhaustion, did not respond. The twins, pressed to each other in the corner, shivered in synchrony, their heads tilting as though hearing more than words, as though listening to some unspoken account of guilt and inevitability. By morning, the house was silent. The storm had passed, leaving the ridge a white, immaculate tomb. Tracks in the snow told the story. One adult, two children, moving with purpose toward the cliff at the edge of the property. No struggle, no resistance, just the drag of small, fragile bodies, a path to the precipice where the world could finally be left behind. Neighbors would later speak of what they found, two bodies caught between rocks, in the partially frozen river below. The mother survived longer, hiding in a small cave carved into the cliffside. When discovered, she held a diary clutched to her chest, pages wet and smeared with blood, words spilling from her despair. "The blood needs new life. May God forgive me, my angels." The town returned to its routines, the mountains remained, and the house slowly rotted into it. Self. But something lingered, an imprint in the soil, the snow, and in the stories whispered across valleys, that a lineage had been carried too far inward, and the consequences were permanent. In the months that followed, the ridge seemed to sigh, a slow exhalation of frost and rotting wood. The father disappeared into the forest, leaving the empty rooms to gather dust. No one entered the main house for weeks, fearing the weight that had been left behind, the smell of decay, the faint, lingering echo of cries that had once filled the walls. The snow melted, revealing tracks that led nowhere, as if the earth itself had swallowed the final steps of the family. It was not until a young doctor arrived in the nearby town 8 months later that the story began to resurface, filtered through curiosity and the lens of observation. Fresh from his studies in genetics, he had volunteered to serve the rural regions, carrying the hope that science might reach places untouched by hospitals or textbooks. He had heard whispers from the locals, half-truths and rumors, but nothing prepared him for what he would discover once he gained the trust of the remaining family members. Initially, he could examine only a handful of children, ostensibly for routine checkups, but the anomalies were immediate, stark and undeniable. Hands with extra fingers, fused digits, malformed jaws, eyes that failed to focus. Cognitive delays so profound that the simplest tasks became impossible. And everywhere, the same pale, fragile bodies that seemed unwilling to grow into the space they had been given. As he dug deeper, compiling records from parish registers, birth certificates, and oral accounts, the doctor reconstructed a family tree that looped back upon itself in dizzying repetition. 7 generations of marriages between cousins, uncles, nieces. A pattern repeated so thoroughly that the family had become a living archive of genetic error. He documented it all, not in whispers but in precise, medical language, yet even he could not ignore the human tragedy beneath the data. The children were more than anomalies. They were evidence of something inevitable, something that had been accumulating silently through decades. And yet, in his notes, he recorded the glimmers of humanity, the moments of recognition between twins, the stubborn will to survive despite impossible odds. Even as the family carried the weight of generations of isolation, some spark remained, stubborn and unyielding. Over the following years, the doctor worked tirelessly, educating the younger generation of the family about the risks that had been inherited, introducing connections with outsiders, arranging marriages that would dilute the concentration of harmful genes. Slowly, the pattern began to break. Children born after these interventions displayed fewer anomalies. The family, once a closed loop of suffering, began to open outward, step by step, generation by generation. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, the ridge had changed, roads improved, electricity reached the cabins. Young people left for work and education, bringing back knowledge that the mountains themselves had once suppressed. And yet, the shadow of the past lingered in the stillness of the abandoned rooms, in the stones of the small family cemetery where the twins rested, and in the whispered lessons carried by those who survived. The mountains had observed everything. They had waited for centuries for this family to return finally to a semblance of balance, and the echoes of what had been done, of the inevitability of isolation and repeated blood, remained etched into the bones of the ridge itself. Even decades later, the ridge remembered. The main house, long abandoned, leaned into itself, timbers splitting under the weight of snow and years of neglect. Windows hung crooked, shattered in places, allowing the wind to enter freely and whisper through the empty rooms. The air carried a memory of the twins, of the mother's last words, of the father's retreat into shadows. Visitors who dared to approach spoke of a chill that did not match the season, a feeling that eyes unseen were watching, measuring, recording. The descendants who remained, scattered through towns and cities, carried the legacy invisibly. Few knew the full story. Many carried physical traits, slight malformations, learning difficulties, that were remnants of generations of insular unions. Some felt unease when confronted with history, an instinctive response to knowledge too heavy to bear. The doctor who had once arrived to document their suffering had long since passed, but his notes survived, meticulously kept in archives that would later guide future generations toward understanding. In 1972, one of the family's more educated members, a nephew who had grown up hearing fragments of the story, established a foundation in the family's name. Using resources from the sale of ancestral land, he created a center for research and education on rare genetic diseases. It was a conscious attempt to transform tragedy into something constructive, to ensure that no one else would endure the quiet suffering that had once filled those mountain walls. The work focused on genetic counseling, outreach to isolated communities, and the study of the very anomalies that had once seemed inescapable. The cemetery where the twins had been laid remained modest for decades. Small stones marked their graves, names barely legible against the weather. But on the 60th anniversary of their deaths, family descendants erected a granite monument. The inscription read simply, Ella Lanina and Edward Blackwood, 1929 to 1937. A brief life, a tragic spark, a symbol that knowledge could emerge from despair. Even in death, they had become the catalyst for understanding and change. The story of the ridge, the twins, and the repeated unions that had shaped a family was eventually documented in journals, articles, and a PBS documenter. Yet, the mountains themselves remained indifferent. They bore the scars of human error silently, their hollows and ridges keeping the memory of isolation, secrecy, and the consequences of inherited patterns. The lessons, however, were no longer trapped in whispers. Researchers, anthropologists, and medical professionals could trace the consequences of isolation and consanguinity with clarity and compassion, using the Blackwoods as a case study that transcended myth and folklore. The ridge had given birth to suffering, but it had also borne witness to change. The mountains kept their silence, but the echoes persisted, in classrooms, in journals, in the quiet moments when descendants spoke of what had been endured. Knowledge had arrived late, but it arrived. The story, once destined to be buried with the snow and the rocks, was now preserved, a warning and a guide. By the time the 1980s arrived, the ridge was almost unrecognizable. Roads cut through the valleys more steadily, and cars now crept where horse-drawn wagons had once labored. Electricity and telephone lines whispered through the trees, carrying signals that had once been impossible. The younger Blackwoods ventured outward, attending schools, working in cities, marrying beyond the mountains. For the first time in over a century, the family's blood had a chance to mingle freely, unbound by the rigid isolation that had once dictated every union. Researchers who returned to the ridge reported a quieter place. The main house had finally collapsed inward. Roof beams were caved under decades of snow, walls bowed with rot. But in the cabins where descendants still lived, something had changed. Children walked steadily, voices carried clearly, limbs bent the way nature intended. The spectral weight of the past was still there, a faint tremor in the corners, a memory in the soil, but the repetition had been broken. Some of the older descendants carried scars invisible to outsiders, subtle deformities, learning differences, small hints of the patterns that had once dominated the family. Yet these were tempered by education, access to medical care, and connections with people beyond the ridge. The work of the young doctor decades earlier, combined with persistent outreach by family members, had altered the trajectory of what once seemed inevitable. The Blackwoods were no longer a closed loop, and with each new generation, the shadow of the past grew thinner. Anthropologists visiting the area remarked on the contrast. The ridge remained a place of extraordinary isolation, steep slopes and treacherous hollows still cutting off easy access, yet the community had begun to integrate itself. Knowledge, once withheld, now traveled freely. Medical histories were discussed without shame. Family trees were drawn not as tools of secrecy, but as instruments of learning. Even so, the twins' graves remained at the heart of the old property, a stark reminder of the consequences that had once been unavoidable. Pilgrims came occasionally, students of history and genetics, to leave small stones, tokens, and notes. The inscription on the granite monument stood like a warning etched in permanence, a testimony to how human decisions, compounded by isolation, could sculpt both tragedy and understanding. The mountains, patient as ever, did not interfere. They watched, carrying in their ridges and hollows the echoes of every misstep, every birth, every whisper that had traveled from cabin to cabin. But where once their silence had suffocated knowledge, it now provided a space in which learning could take root, sheltered from the hurried judgments of the outside world. The ridge, its snow melting into streams that twisted down the mountainside, had finally begun to yield its lessons. Generations of error were recorded, studied, and understood. What had once been whispered folklore, dark and fearful, had been transformed into a chronicle of survival, adaptation, and the slow triumph of knowledge over inherited tragedy. By the early 1990s, the Blackwood name had begun to carry a new weight. No longer whispered with fear or avoidance, it became a symbol of what could emerge when tragedy met persistence, when isolation met knowledge. Descendants now moved freely across the country, some carrying subtle reminders of the past in their bodies or memories, but most carrying something far more enduring, understanding. The lessons of the ridge had not been lost. The foundation established decades earlier had grown into a regional institution. Genetic counseling became available to neighboring families, particularly those who, like the Blackwoods had once been, remained trapped by distance and tradition. The research stemming from the ridge informed broader studies on the consequences of consanguinity, guiding physicians, anthropologists, and social workers alike. Children born into isolated or interrelated populations now had a chance that had never existed for Elanina and Edward, or for the generations before them. Yet, the ridge retained its secrets. The collapsed main house, hidden by overgrowth, still harbored the scent of age and sorrow. The cabins where the surviving families once lived carried faint echoes, the tremble of hands that had once labored under impossible burdens. the whispered lullabies that had soothed deformed bodies, the soft cries of children who never fully thrived. Pilgrims and researchers alike spoke of a sensation of being watched, of the land itself remembering the wrongs that had unfolded upon it. The twins themselves, Elenina and Edward, were no longer remembered as failures or monstrosities. They became the axis upon which change turned. A small granite monument marked their graves, simple and silent, yet it radiated a quiet authority, a statement that suffering could be transformed into learning, that even the briefest lives could leave a legacy that reached far beyond the mountains. Those who visited often left small tokens, a stone, a flower, a note. Some whispered apologies, others whispered thanks. And in the quiet moments, when the wind moved through the trees just right, it carried with it the memory of the house as it had been, the mother bent with care, the father withdrawn and distant, the twins locked together in their mirrored suffering. It carried the cries, the quiet gasps of early mornings, the agonized scribbles of understanding attempting to manifest on scraps of paper. The mountains held these echoes, not as punishment, but as record, an archive of human error, endurance, and eventual redemption. The story of the Blackwoods, once a tale of isolation, deformity, and despair, had evolved into something else entirely. It was a warning, yes, but also a testament. Knowledge could emerge from tragedy. Life could be restored from ruin. The twins' brief existence had catalyzed a chain of change, stretching decades into the future. In the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, history had left its imprint, but it was no longer trapped in shadows. The Questi on remains, whispered through the ridges and valleys. What would you do if you discovered the family you thought you knew carried the secrets of generations folded upon itself? And what would you do if those secrets were still alive, lingering in the blood that flows through your own veins? The mountains, silent as ever, wait. The story ends, but the echoes persist.